Hello, and thanks for joining us. My name is Bill Gwaltney, and I presently serve as the president of the newly formed African Americans in the Civil War Era Roundtable. As a new addition to the long-standing Civil War Roundtable community, we believe that we're the first roundtable to focus specifically on the impact of the Civil War era on African Americans and the impact that African Americans had on the Civil War and the United States. On behalf of the AACWERT, I am pleased to welcome you to the first in our series of short videos on the Civil War. At the end of this program, I hope that you will become a member of our roundtable and participate in free video programs from the past and live presentations in the future at no charge. Just about every family I know keeps photographs, documents, and other keepsakes that help them remember their past with hope for the future. Our largest family, that being all of us who claim American citizenship, also have places where we keep reminders of the past. Today, I will share with you images of keepsakes of freedom that repose in our national attic, the Smithsonian Institution, the National Archives, and the Library of Congress. I will share with you evidence that our terrible and bloody Civil War did produce some results that are worth remembering with pride. Today, we will be talking about how one of the most difficult periods of our history transformed Civil War into civil rights. I also plan to make the connection between the Civil War, American citizenship, and changes to the U.S. Constitution. Please turn off your microphones during the program so that the noise that comes with daily living does not interfere with the ability of others to clearly hear the program. Later on, I will be asking questions during the program, so please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen to answer them. I will be pleased to entertain your questions at the end of our 10-minute program, so please place them in the chat room so that we can get to all of them. The sad truth is that the American Civil War caused the deaths of at least 750,000 soldiers. The human cost in killed and wounded civilians has yet to be accurately identified. In the words of President Abraham Lincoln, what the nation got out of this cataclysmic tragedy was a new birth of freedom. Slowly but surely, the military prosecution of the war created the need for political responses that soon changed even more quickly did our military tactics of the day. In 1861, at the beginning of the war, not only was there no intent by the federal government to recruit or use black men as soldiers, but there had been a law in place that prohibited that consideration since 1792. Some predicted that the Civil War would be a short and bloodless war, but it soon became a protracted and deadly conflict. As early as the first year of the war, the U.S. Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, which allowed the federal government to seize property, including enslaved persons, whose labor was being used to support the Confederate cause. As the war deepened, more political action was required. In 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, which authorized the federal government to free slaves in conquered rebel territory and prohibit the return of fugitive slaves, while allowing for the confiscation of Confederate property through court action. Passed at the same time was the Militia Act of 1862, which made it legal for African American men to enlist in the United States Army for the purpose of, quote, constructing entrenchments or performing camp service. Confederate successes in the battlefield, however, made further change imperative. On September 22, 1862, after a narrow Union victory at the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It said that enslaved people in Confederate-held territories would be declared forever free on the 1st of January, 1863. This proclamation would change the course and purpose of the war. By 1863, the final Emancipation Proclamation was the law of the land. This order freed slaves in southern controlled territories, and perhaps as importantly, also authorized enlistment of African Americans as Union soldiers. Before the war was over, more than 180,000 black men would don the Union blue uniform and fight for their own freedom and that of their families. Their willingness to fight and to die was not ignored by the U.S. Congress, who in April of 1864 passed the 13th Amendment, which would officially end the institution of slavery. With Union victories now sounding a death blow for the Confederacy, by 1865, the Republican U.S. Congress passed the bill, and it was ratified in December of 1865. By the end of the Civil War, there were more black men in uniform for the Union Army than there were Confederates in the entire South. In an effort to right centuries of wrongs, the U.S. Congress voted in 1865 to create and fund the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, commonly referred to as the Freedmen's Bureau. It would have the job of providing food, shelter, medical services, a rudimentary education, clothing, and lands to persons displaced by the war, with an emphasis on the formerly enslaved. With the war over, Congress recognized that the fight for freedom for all Americans had, in a sense, just begun, and in June of 1866 passed the 14th Amendment, which established equal rights for all Americans, regardless of race. In that same year, Congress passed the Army Organization Act, which for the first time permitted the recruitment and employment of African Americans in the regular Army. These black troops not only went on to serve in the West as, quote, Buffalo Soldiers, unquote, but can be considered America's first permanent black government employees. In 1866 and 1867, the U.S. government passed legislation to begin a tough and tortured program in the South to reassert federal control and provide for political and personal protections for African Americans. These Reconstruction Acts established military rule over southern states until new democratic governments could be formed. Knowing that their work was far from over, in 1869, the U.S. Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which would grant African American men the right to vote. The amendment would not be ratified, however, until 1870. By looking at these artifacts, we can plainly see a direct and relevant connection between the Civil War, African American military service, the Emancipation Proclamation, and a changing U.S. Constitution. We have seen that certain artifacts of our past, such as photos and records, still tell stories as current as today's latest news. Issues surrounding race, citizenship, and voting are still highly debated today. Those documents, photographs, and other records help connect our memory with meanings. Our time today is limited, but I invite you to investigate this history by finding for yourself these keepsakes of freedom in your local library or online or in person at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., the National Archives and Records Administration, or at the Library of Congress. Their online information is shown on your screen and is also found in the chat room. Before we look at what questions you may have, I want to pose the following questions to you to respond to using the raise hand feature in the chat room. My three questions are, first, can you identify a strong connection between the Civil War and civil rights? Please give at least one example in your response. From what you've learned today, what is the earliest date that you can identify that speaks to the federal government attempting to establish citizenship for African Americans? And finally, again using the raise hand feature, please indicate if you would like to support the African Americans in the Civil War Roundtable by becoming a member at no cost. To become a member of the African Americans in the Civil War Era Roundtable, please contact Vice President Jeffrey Blancett at the following email address. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again as a member of our growing organization. And now, let's take a look at your questions.